Okay, right. Thanks, everyone. So good morning, everyone. So yeah, and good evening for those not in the UK. So I've been asked to just talk through some of the work I've been doing recently about looking at surface air pollutants in the CMIP6 models, with both a historical point of view and a present day, and then the future to see what the latest generation of the Earth system coupled climate composition models are, or how they're performing. So apologies if some of you have seen this before, because it has been a topic of mine going forward for the last year or so. So yeah, there's some new results in there hopefully as well, and some previous ones. So yeah, we'll go through them now. So yeah, probably don't need to speak to this audience about why air pollutants are important. So we look at them for health reasons, for poor air quality, damage to vegetation, crops, and obviously their interactions with climate. So this is where I'm focusing on this in the CMIP sort of studies, the interaction with the sort of air pollutants and their effect on climate. So these have been termed short-lived climate forces, near-term climate forces, or various different names in between. But really what we're looking at is the tropospheric ozone impact on the radiative forcing here. This is the last IPCC report. And then the aerosol interactions, and also there at the surface, they both have implications for air quality and leading to poor air quality impacts on human health. So we'll skip through these relatively quickly. But one of the interesting things of the CMIP work and looking at this future scenarios and how the historical is how the policies for the climate change and mitigation interact with the air pollutants. And so in terms of some climate policies can actually worsen air quality, and that's not really what we say want to happen. We want to have both benefits for air quality and climate. So this is where this sort of diagram comes in, where we're looking at policies that do one or the other or both. So we want this term has been bandied around a bit, the win-win policy scenarios, which have both benefits for air quality and climate. So this is in this top right-hand corner of this figure, where we have measures that improve air quality and air pollutants at the surface, and also have benefits to climate in the longer term as well. So other policies recently have been in this sort of field, where we have an air quality benefit, because these measures have been targeted for air quality benefits, such as removing SO2 from power stations, but then also that can have the impact on the climate by leading to near-term warming. So it's these sort of measures which do a bit of both, or one or the other, which we want to try and push to this top right-hand sort of side of this diagram. So when thinking about the sort of future CMIP6 policies and the scenarios there, that's kind of where I'm thinking about as well. So with that in mind, I was trying to put into context where these SSPs and these CMIP6 scenarios, and where do they fit into that diagram just on the other page, and what do they do for both air quality and climate, and what is the interaction of that? So for those of you who aren't aware, or some of you might be obviously well versed with these policy scenarios, this is the main sort of scenario MIP SSPs that have been done for CMIP6. So ranging from in the top here, which is very much sustainability pathways with low climate targets. So this is the SSP number, refers to this narrative in the SSP. So 1 is a sustainability pathway, 2 is a middle road, etc. You can read down the side there. And then the last 2 numbers are the radiative forcing targets by the end of the century. So as you can see, these are the real strong climate mitigation scenarios at the top here, running down to the sort of poorly, don't really do much for climate scenarios at the bottom. And then this one in the middle here is a particular variant which has been done for AerChemMIP, and probably get mentioned again later in this meeting, where they've used the same climate pathway as this SSP 370 scenario, and then applied aggressive mitigation measures to near-term climate forces and such aerosols, ozone precursors, and some extra scenarios have even targeted methane as well going forward. So that's our sort of policy range, and we wanted to think about where that fits in sort of this air quality climate mitigation benefits, co-benefits, and detriment sort of diagram. So I've tried with my own judgment to sort of split these up now and where they fit on this little quadrant diagram. So if you can follow the scenarios where they disappear to, we can see we have a fairly wide range of scenarios with different levels of air quality climate benefits or detriments, depending on what you want. So ranging from this SSP3 scenario, which tends to not target air pollutants and has a relatively high CO2 pathway, and especially methane into the future, to these ones in the far right, where go after the air pollutants and the short-lived climate forces, as well as the long-lived greenhouse gases as well. So, and going for ones in the middle, and ones which have benefits to air quality, which maybe not for climate. So again, there's quite a wide range of scenarios here compared to maybe the CMIP 5 ones, which enable you to span the whole range of these different benefits and penalties. So taking those forward, then what does that mean for air pollutant emissions in these different scenarios? So this is those same scenarios just had on the last slide, and now split up with global air pollutant emissions looked at throughout the 21st century. So as we can see, we've got our SO2, OC, BC, our aerosol precursors at the top there, and then the ozone precursors and methane concentrations here at the bottom right. So this is looking at the global change from 2015, which is the present day value in the CMIP 6 future scenarios. So again, our SSP 370 scenario, which is our sort of high pathway, which doesn't really mitigate air pollutants or long-lived greenhouse gases, you can see it always becomes the top, and there's even some increases compared to present day in certain, globally anyway. The regional differences are apparent as well. And then you go down to these high mitigation pathways is SSP1s, where you can see there's really rapid, aggressive mitigation measures out to the sort of middle century and going down after that. So there is a wide range of different air pollution trajectories in these different scenarios. And again, as you can see, you can fit which one you want to consider in between. And methane, again, is quite an interesting pathway in this, where you can see the SSP 370 again, it goes really up quite quickly. And then there's other ones which sort of target methane towards the end of the 21st century as well. And then some which really aggressively target it in the near term. So that leads to quite different range of scenarios to consider. So just a quick word on the regional and timescale here. So this is now looking at the change in emissions for these different air pollutant precursors now over a selection of different regions across the x-axis, and for 5 of the scenarios up the y-axis. And the 2 dots for each scenario for each region are different time horizon periods. So this is the change relative to 2015 to 2100 and 2050. So why I've highlighted it this way is important because, as you saw on the last one, even for the global pictures, some emissions can increase up to 2050 and then reduce afterwards. So there is a temporal element to this as well as a spatial element. So as you can see, the spatial element is quite stark between countries maybe like Europe, where we have lots of reductions for most air pollutant emissions, to somewhere like South Asia, which is predicted in at least the low mitigation scenarios to rapidly increase in both the near term and the long term for some air pollutants. And in others, it's going to increase in the near term for SO2 here in South Asia, but then reduce out to the longer term. So yeah, I just wanted to make this point that there are quite regional disparities here and temporal changes, which are important to consider when looking at these changes in air pollutants and how they affect. So I just thought I'd put a point how I'm mentioning now with the CMIP 6 scenarios, where we have a much more wide variety than previously. As we can see, this is a comparison now, again, of the global emissions in those same air pollutants that I've showed before, but showing the range in the CMIP 6 scenarios here in the blue against the range in the CMIP 5 in the green. So just for example, on the top left of something like NOx, we can see the range in the CMIP 6 scenarios covers a much larger space than the narrow range in the CMIP 5 scenarios. And that's similar for something like BC as well, and CO and other pickup of your air pollutants of choice. So again, just making the point that the CMIP 6 scenarios go from low mitigation to really high mitigation and everything in between, whereas the CMIP 5 were much more narrow. So this gives us a much wider scope, again, to look at different air pollutant pathways and their effect on climate and air quality into the future. But also, again, one other point to mention, obviously, that air pollutants can obviously also be affected by climate change. And obviously in all these different CMIP scenarios, we have different climate change pathways going on and different temperature effects and other things that go with rainfall changes and circulation patterns as well. So this is just a figure to show the surface air temperature changes from 2015 again in 4 of the different main scenarios here. And this is in the multi-model CMIP 6 model range and a multi-model mean into the solid line. So again, looking globally, you can see some pathway like SSP5, the multi-model mean is about 5 degrees warmer by the end of the century in all the models. And if we're looking at something like SSP126, it's about 1.5 to 2 degrees warmer. And then again, we get 4 or 3 degrees in between. So again, regional temperature effects are obviously amplified over the North Pole and the Arctic and other regions as well. So again, as well as we've got these lots of different regional emission changes going on, we have all this in the background, this different climate change effects in these different pathways going on as well, which have an effect. So as a quick run through the sort of CMIP scenarios and introduction there. So I was just going to talk about some of the work now I've been doing where I've been looking at these different changes in the CMIP6 models, which sort of involves looking at historical and the future changes in some of the scenarios. And I've tried to do a bit of a present day evaluation of some of the ozone and PM2.5 concentrations predicted by the different models. And then there's also been some work I've been involved with where we've been looking at the mitigation of near-term climate forces and the impact on both air quality and climate with and without methane policies included. And then again, this does highlight some of the work that, there's lots of different intricacies between the CMIP6 models and their projections. So apologies if I go through quite quickly, but yeah, I'm aware I'm probably running short of time straight away. So here, I just wanted to show that the different number of CMIP6 models I have used in my study anyway, looking at the different air pollutants. So we have the scenarios with the most information from the different models, and we've got different CMIP6 models down the left, and then the number of ensemble members I was able to get to use in my different analysis. So again, there's a different, this becomes a matrix of quantity and less quality for some. So we have a number of models contributing quite a lot to different scenarios, but others with only a few scenarios. So as you can see, when the totals down, we tend to have 6 models in total for some of the main CMIP6 models with interactive chemistry, so we can get an ozone out of that. And then for the PM, we have a lot more aerosol models, but again, it varies depending on which models, which scenarios have done. So there was a bit of a mix and match going on here between the models and the scenarios. So I just thought I'd show a quick slide on the historical changes predicted by the CMIP6 models now. In terms of changes in surface ozone and surface PM2.5. So this is a regional plot now showing changes between the sort of pre-industrial 1850 time period to present day, the sort of 2015s, in surface ozone, which is on the left of these bar charts here, and then surface PM2.5, which is on the right. So the bars represent the multimodal means in the left, which is annual mean changes in the green, December, January, February changes in the blue, and June, July, and August changes in the red. And that's the same for both pollutants. And then the individual dots are the different CMIP6 models, if you're so interested in your model of choice, particularly down there and seeing what they do. So obviously this highlights there's been large changes in particularly surface ozone over most northern hemisphere and tropical regions and mid-latitudes since the pre-industrial. And again, the PM2.5 and I guess to some extent the surface ozone changes in maybe regions like North America and Europe are a bit muted in here because we have already potentially had the peak in sort of the 80s and 90s, and then where the change is smaller now relative to present day. But then that does show on time series when you can look at the time series throughout the whole historical evolution. So yes, we get relatively large changes there, and we can see the PM2.5 being quite large in the Asian regions now as well, and so surface ozone. So again you can see some models, particularly in the light blue here, are maybe skewing the multimodal mean higher, and then another model in the light pink here is bringing it down, and then there's a collection between. So there is still quite a lot of diversity between the different models in what they predict the changes of the historical period in surface ozone and PM2.5 is. And you get particularly some diversity around some dusty regions in the PM. As you can see here, the changes are uncertain between different models of what's happening. And you get quite spread over some regions like South Asia in the PM as well. So it was just trying to summarize, what the models are doing in which seasons, is there a seasonal change, and how the diversity affects between different models. So going from the historical to the present day. So this is my attempt to do some present day model evaluation now, looking at surface ozone on the left-hand side here against the TOR observations, and surface PM2.5 against a collection of different networks around the globe that have been put together. So on the left, the surface ozone here, this shows again, this is a seasonal mean response now in each of the models. Each of the models is represented by the colored lines, and the solid black is the multimodal mean. And overlaid with that is the observed average over these different regions in the diamonds, and this sort of light shading is the diversity again in the observations compared to the multimodal means represented there. So again, you can see tends to be the overriding factor is that all these CMIP6 models tend to overestimate surface ozone, particularly in the summer periods. And there also seems in the Northern Hemisphere to be a slight timing issue with not enough peak in the sort of spring period and more in the summer. And then some models obviously have aren't able to represent the seasonal cycle very well at this lowest model level. So there are some differences between the models there as well. But some areas they do seem to get a seasonal cycle right. It's just there's too much ozone at the lowest levels in the model. Well, taking the PM 2.5 observations, and I should say there is obviously a natural discrepancy which most of the models here don't have nitrate in their schemes, so there is obviously an underestimation already there compared to the observations. But even taking account of the few models that do include nitrate, there is still an underestimation in the PM 2.5. So there is still too little aerosol at the surface in these fine fractions in the CMIP6 models compared to what is observed over these regions. But again, you can see the seasonal cycle maybe is quite well predicted over the North America region, even though it's under-predicted. There's an under-prediction in Europe, and then you can see most of the other regions there is still an under-prediction in most comparisons to observations. So it was just trying to give us a general flavour of how the models are performing in the present day and what does that mean for our historical and future projections. So now to get on to the future projections now, to try and rattle through these quite quickly. So again, on the left-hand side, this is my regional mean change in surface ozone in 5 different scenarios here. So again, going from the ones with highly mitigated both climate and air pollutants, so you can see they generally decrease surface ozone over virtually all regions and globally in the CMIP6 models, and there's quite a consistent response generally in that pattern. And even for the middle of the road scenarios, there tends to be a leveling off around present day out into the sort of middle of the 21st century, and then tends to be reductions out to end of the 21st century. Whereas where it gets interesting when you look at these 2 higher end pathways of the SSP 370 and SSP 585, you can see there's generally an increase over a lot of the regions in surface ozone. So that's a combination of the emissions changing in different ways over different regions, and also the climate signal impacting on top of that. So just to take a couple of regions of particular interest quickly, and on the right hand side here, sorry, this is the 2050 change over the different regions, and each bar represents an individual model now. So whereas here on the left hand side it's a multi-model mean with a diversity spread in the shading, and now you can see how the actual individual models are predicting the change in surface ozone over different regions. And just to highlight the 2 Asian regions where their emissions are changing to different extents in the near and the far future into these scenarios, and you can see that the models tend to disagree to the extent of the future ozone response. And if you look at the individual symbols here, there are different seasonal responses as well. So you can see in South Asia there is a reduction in 2 models in the DJF response, and there's a slightly lower, there's still an increase in these other 2 models in both seasons. And again, similar for East Asia, there's different responses in the different models and different extent of seasonal responses. So that's quite interesting to further explore why are the causes for these and what are the different models doing differently over these regions to cause their responses to vary so much into the future. So I've had an attempt at that in this work to look at that, or to try and link what maybe potential some of the drivers are and some of the correlations between different important variables in terms of both surface ozone here and PM later. So again, just quickly, this is the correlation coefficients now between surface ozone changes in the SSP 370 scenario into the future, where it tends to increase over most of the regions, and then some of the different drivers I've been able to easily get off from CMIP6 data. So we've got methane concentration change, surface air temperature, PVOC emissions from models that provide them, NOx emissions, and input VOC emissions. So again, there's some interesting patterns that come up here. I could just highlight a few quickly. So over South Asia, all the models seem to agree that the ozone response is correlating quite well with virtually most of drivers that they have in their model. So not saying that they're all equally important or they're all causing the change, but they're all going the same direction, let's say. Whereas there maybe is some more disagreement over some of the more biogenically influenced regions, where we can see the UK model here at the top has some of the climate emission drivers here. Sorry, that is, yes, the emission drivers and the climate variables sort of opposite ways, and then the other models disagree to the extent of which way these ozone signal is going and which way the drivers are telling us it's going as well. And again, that's similar over some other regions as well. So this is trying to just flag where it's maybe more important to investigate, say, NOx in some regions in some models, like where NOx is driving, is correlating with the reduction, or where it's going with the increase. So that flags up some models which have a different response in, say, that compared to others. So this is trying to use this knowledge to further investigation into the future. So just quickly do the same sort of analysis for PM 2.5. So this is changing PM 2.5 regionally now in the different scenarios. And again, there's lower changes over some of these Northern European regions, as a lot of their emissions aren't reducing as much, or how we're starting from a lower base as well into the future. So just to quickly highlight some of the more interesting regions of change that I've noticed in some of the different models. And we can see the East Asia region, which has obviously high levels of aerosols at the moment, that the SSP-free scenario is not really going to change that over the near term until we get out to the longer term future, whereas the other scenarios which have these larger reductions in aerosol precursors really go after those emissions and reduce those concentrations. And again, that can be shown on here, even though they have that, there is some disagreement between the models' responses again. So again, we've got 4 different models here, and there are different changes in East Asia into the future in this SSP-free scenario by 2050. So again, some models are predicting an increase, some are predicting a decrease, and some are predicting not much change. So that's interesting. There are different aerosol schemes, different couplings in the Earth system that might explain some of the changes again. And this is further work that needs to be investigated, I think, in much more detail. And 2 of the more remote, again, biogenetically influenced regions show quite an interesting response, particularly in this SSP-free scenario. So we can see Southern Africa and South America, we have this increase in PM 2.5 in most of the models, and there's large diversity. And splitting this up again on the different models on their region, we can see this green model, CSM2, has quite a strong increase into the future in these 2 regions, whereas maybe the pink again over Southern Africa has particularly a reduction there in Southern Africa. So that's quite an interesting opposite response, and the other 2 models tend to sit in the middle. So yeah, that's going to be interesting going forward. And I tried to make these diagrams again with these correlation responses to try and understand maybe what is driving these different changes in these models. So the Southern Africa response is quite interesting in that that UK model here. So these are slightly different drivers this time for aerosols, that we have different variables available. But you can see the UK model sort of sticks out compared to all the other CMIP6 models I have the information for. So there's an interesting different response over this region in that model, and it's potentially due to some of these changes that are happening here, which are different to some of the other changes in some of the other models. So we have temperature, precipitation in the blue, and then some of the aerosol precursor emissions again. So that's sort of hinting of maybe where this change is being affected and where we should look into the future. And again, we see similar patterns over some regions, or driving in the same directions, or again, potentially over North America, where we have opposite responses in a couple of models compared to the others. So I think this needs more thought about the aerosol schemes, their couplings, and what is potentially driving these changes into the future. So I'll just get on to the last couple of points, because I'm probably running a bit low on time. So yes, so this is about another study now, which is I'm not directly involved with, which looks specifically at the climate and air quality impacts from mitigating these near-term climate forces now. This is a paper led by Rob Allen, where he looked at the SSP 370 scenario, which mentioned, and its sort of parallel partner, the SSP 370 with low near-term mitigation. So the aggressively targeting these near-term short-lived climate forces and air pollutants. So what we found, the instantaneous response, and looking at these figures here, which show the 2 scenarios, one with a strong air quality control in the blue, and one with a weak air quality control, which is the SSP-free main scenario, and look at the difference between these air quality variables in ozone and PM, and then these climate responses. So, and what we found instantly was obviously targeting air pollutant precursors like NOx, VOC, CO, and the aerosol precursors of SO2, BC, OC. We can see this strong surface air quality benefit over virtually all these regions he considered up here. And globally. So that was a good thing to obviously targeting those measures. You see the benefits air quality you wanted to, but what does this mean for climate? So he also found there was a surface warming over most regions from targeting both the ozone and the aerosol precursors. So this is not including methane at the moment on this. There was an increase in some of the hottest days and some wetting in the precipitation responses as well in all the models, and some of the other variables as well. So what generally the result from this was that, yeah, targeting these near-term climate forces in the short term, because this is only up to 2050, we saw this benefit to air quality, but also this impact of slightly increasing warming and more precipitation in the near term. So that was an interesting response, and that was what we had from these scenarios initially. So then there was a follow-up which has been now conducted again by Rob Allen, and involving a new scenario where the near-term climate forces has also now included methane on top of it. So we can see the additional benefit from methane on top of these ozone and aerosol precursor emissions mitigation. So this is essentially what these four figures are showing now. We have a surface temperature response, and we have the non-methane near-term climate forces mitigating the blue, which is kind of what we saw on the last slide in all those changes. So we saw this positive warming response here, and now the green is the near-term mitigation including methane. So yes, we have this extra cooling effect from the methane now, and the grey is the methane mitigation effect on its own, separated out. We only have 4 models for this in this study, and then the multi-model mean on the right. So you can see the added benefit to climate from methane mitigation is to offset this warming response that we saw in the previous figure, just mainly from the aerosol response on its own. And what does that mean? We have a similar effect in precipitation as well. So we can see the blue, which was without methane, and we can see this added effect now of reducing this increase in precipitation from methane reductions. And again, adding this effect to the air quality indicators of PM2.5, it doesn't make too much difference in the different CMIP6 models. But whereas for surface ozone, there's this added extra benefit now, as you can see in the green, which is enhanced ozone reductions globally and other regions which aren't shown here by about 40 to 50%. So there's definitely this increased extra benefit here. And again, there's some larger changes on different regions that were shown in the previous figure as well, which occur here. So particularly improvements of Asia, and in some sort of large impacts over the Arctic as well. So that was quite interesting. So yeah, with thinks of time, because it's easy to lose track of time when you're just talking to yourself on these things, I think. So yeah, so I just wanted to show a quick run through there of both, CMIP6 models are showing both regional increases and decreases in air pollutants depending on their particular scenario. There's definitely important impacts for methane in different future scenarios, and that's definitely shown by the work of helped out with Rob Allen, where he has looked at the additional impact of methane on these top of these near-term climate forces. And there's definitely more work to look at in terms of these intermodal differences in the CMIP6 models and highlighting what they do differently. And I think further work needs to explore why are some of these changes important over different regions and what's driving them really. And I think there's definitely more that can be learned from these CMIP6 AerChemMIP sensitivity studies. And I think I'm sure other people will be looking at them as well. And that's definitely a focus that I'm going to try and look into, dig into why and what's driving some of these changes more. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Fantastic talk. I think everybody in the chat agrees. We've got some questions which I'm going to take in order that they were posted, and they're grouped loosely by topic as well. So Professor Unger says, fantastic talk, Steve, thank you. And then notes, there are no surface ozone observations in India or the global south. How can we deal with this? And then asks the more challenging question, what value do scenarios and projections have without any validation in these areas? Can AerChemMIP simulations actually simulate surface PM 2.5 and ozone air quality as a result?
Yes,
Steve,
very good questions.
Yeah. Drink another bit of coffee.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you may perk up for those ones. Yeah. I mean, I think I go back to the if I get my cursor on the right thing. The observations, that's always a challenging part. I mean, these are just from the TOR database in the rural sites, because again, I've taken the fact that the global models, obviously their resolutions will struggle to replicate values over urban areas, particularly in densely populated regions as well. So So I think saying there's no observations is probably not true, because I think there are observations. It's more, have we got observations that we can usefully use for these evaluations? And in terms of the products that are created and supplied at the moment, easy off the shelf stuff, there's probably not a lot. So it's probably hard to say things about that. I know there are some work where other people have used observations over India and sort of those regions. So I think there are some, and some work that could be done, especially like in China as well. There are observations obviously now as well that just didn't make into this global tour product that's been produced. And I think there is another version of that coming out which will include observations over China. So yeah, I think it's difficult sometimes to say how well are we doing. And I think for some of the uncertainty values I've seen over these regions, that especially in the future and the historical projections, that I think probably models are struggling to agree on what's happening, and we don't know, and it's a complicated chemical meteorological environment to get right. So yeah, I think it's definitely a challenge, and I probably don't have a definitive answer for that question at the moment, I'm afraid. So yeah, it's a tricky one to get right, and I think there are people looking at different ways of evaluating, and there have been some global data sets of surface ozone observation made. We should try to incorporate some of these surface sites and satellite observations and things like that. So I think there are some ways of doing it probably better than I have done here. It was more doing this at a time when there was time pressure and what was available. So yeah, I think it's a tricky one, I think, to say. Yeah, but I think as what I'm seeing into the future projections, I think caution is probably the word to take forward in these projections over those regions, because we are uncertain as well. And whether they can actually simulate surface ozone and air quality, well, yeah, that's always been an issue with these, I think, global scales of these models. And I guess it depends on what your definition of air quality is. If you're focusing on city and particularly human health study, that's a different question, just to looking at regional big scale concentration changes and what can affect a large population, which I guess is probably what these more usefuls for these models to do. And I think there are ways of correcting these models for biases and things like that over particular regions to improve their simulation as well. So I think they're useful to have these long scale projections, because NOVA models can do these with interactive composition, and maybe it's just a way of trying to correct the present day biases and assume we can have something similar going out into the future. And people do that as well for looking at long-term health studies as well. So yeah, I think there are things we can do, but it's obviously not perfect either.
David Stevenson asks about the comparison between surface ozone and the TOR database, and particularly the overestimation. He asks, do we know if this overestimation is to do with urban NOx titration and nighttime lack of ozone loss in the models? And then asks, does the overestimation persist if you just look at the very rural sites or the daytime only data?
Yeah, okay, so these are rural sites to start with, but they are a mean over every time period. So potentially sorting it out into daytime only, or removing the nighttime, that might make the comparisons look slightly different, I think. I didn't do that for this as well. I just wanted to do a blanket sort of comparison, really, initially, just to not exclude anything. So again, I think going further to the last point, I think there's probably better ways this can be done into the future, and I don't think this is finished in terms of any extent of evaluating these models. I think this is more of a first look to see what they were like and how they were performing, and exposing some of these biases, because again, these models have probably never been compared to these observations before. So yeah, I think this is just the beginning maybe of this work of looking at what is the issues causing some of these differences. I mean, again, because we've got the figure up here, we can see that obviously just looking over the North America region as a whole, obviously this pink line is the UK model. So obviously there's some interesting effects going on in sort of the wintertime biases compared to these observations over this broad region. So again, maybe these broad regions aren't the best way of doing these evaluations either, but it made sense because I was doing these projections into these regions in the past and the future. So yeah, so maybe picking off certain areas where to be the chemical production and loss to be different, that might be a better way of doing it as well. And you can identify further deficiencies in the models, and then just looking at GISS model here, it's got no seasonal response in what I had. So I mean, you've got one where it's too strong and one where it's not strong enough. So, and then in between. So yeah, I think there's a lot of differences in these models, and yeah, it's going to take a bit more to dig into if you want to look into your individual model of choice. And I probably don't have all the answers of exactly what's causing the discrepancies in all the different models. So yeah, that's further work definitely to go on, I think.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see what happens when you have higher time frequency output, I guess.
Yeah.
Bill Collins asks, with his chapter lead hat on, are the same models consistently high or low in their future predictions, i.e. in all regions or all scenarios, or is it more random with some being high in some and some low in others?
Yeah, so I think that's a yes and no question, I think, in that, yeah, some models definitely have large predictions consistently in some areas, but not all. So it's hard to see from this figure, obviously, because on the left-hand side anyway, because obviously we just got a multi-model mean spread. I have got the individual scenarios with the individual models plotted on as well, but not here. But I guess you get a kind of flavor here on this right-hand side figure of looking at the 4 models I picked out of the 6 now, and they're changing, which is up to 2050. And you can see that the BCC model consistently predicts higher ozone changes in virtually all regions, but not all. So yeah, it's yeah, and then you can see CSM2 tends to be second in a lot of regions, but maybe not all. So yeah, I don't think it's quite as simple as always being the same models, but there is a consistent pattern. Maybe in some of the polluted regions, it's the same models, and UK ESM1 tends to be on the lower side of the predictions in most of the regions, and the BCC CSM2 tends to be on the higher side. So I think there's definitely generalizations you can make like that, but I don't think it's always consistent everywhere. So.
Okay, thanks, Steve. I think for the interest of time, we're going to put a pin in it there. Fiona has informed us that she's put all the questions and comments in a Google Doc. So Stephen, it's action on you to take a look at that and maybe address the other questions offline. Apologies to those whose questions we didn't have time to get to. But now I think it's over to Fiona, if I can get the slides up. Can everybody see those slides? Particularly Fiona.
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Paul. So Bill thought it would be useful in terms of planning new analysis to make people aware of the capabilities of UK ESM1, and in particular there are some capabilities in the UK's Earth system model that aren't replicated in other models. And then I also thought I would just give a brief outline of the simulations that are available. And indeed for UK ESM1, we've also done some additional ones. Next slide, please. So the UK's Earth system model is represented here in the figure. So the blue boxes are representing the physical components, although the ocean is absent, but there is a coupled ocean and sea ice models as well. And then the green boxes are representing the additional Earth system components like interactive chemistry, ocean biogeochemistry, terrestrial biogeochemistry, and then some additional changes to the aerosol scheme, like primary marine organic aerosol. And an overview of the model description and the components included in it are in a paper by Alistair Steller that was published in James in 2019. Moving on to the next slide. We have an interactive chemistry scheme in the Earth system model, and the key points of that scheme are listed there along the left, and in red is showing the the upgrade or the increased capability of the chemistry model relative to our CMIP5 model. So for example, photolysis is interactive now, whereas previously in our CMIP5 model it was prescribed. We're also including a stratospheric chemistry scheme, and you'll see the other additional developments marked in red. On the right there, I've chosen then two comparisons from the paper from Archibald et al. I'm hoping you can see that it's from Archibald et al. It seems to be knocked off the bottom of my screen. So there's a description and evaluation paper in GMD published earlier this year. And you can see on the right two comparisons from that paper. One looking at total ozone comparisons, and the other looking at tropospheric ozone against OMI-MLS data. So in terms of total ozone, you can see that we have positive biases almost everywhere, but too strong and too deep an ozone hole in the southern high latitudes. And you can see that against OMI-MLS, we're capturing the seasonal cycle very well in the middle latitudes in the northern hemisphere, and we're within the uncertainty of the observations in the other latitude bands there. Moving on to the next slide, there was significant development in terms of the aerosol representation in the model relative to CMIP5. In particular now, it's including a two-moment aerosol scheme to represent sulfate, sea salt, black carbon, and organic carbon. So that's quite a step change from the CMIP5 model, where we only had a mass-based scheme, and indeed sea salt in the CMIP5 model was diagnostic, whereas now it's prognostic. So we're modeling both mass and number. Dust is an external mixture to and that's still treated by the Woodward bin scheme. And again, you can see now where in the CMIP5 model, SOA was prescribed as a climatology. It's now interactive, and it's the yield of SOA is determined by the oxidants from the interactive chemistry. And on the right, then, I'm showing a sample of comparisons against observations from this paper by Mulcahy et al. And again, I'm hoping you can see it at the bottom of the slide on the left. The first is showing a time series of trends of surface sulfate concentrations using observational networks over the US, over Europe, and over East Asia. And you can see that although there are biases in the absolute concentrations, the model is capturing the trend in the downward surface concentrations over Europe and over the US. And then on the bottom is showing comparisons against present day surface black carbon and organic matter. So again, a full description and evaluation of the aerosol scheme can be found in Mulcahy et al. So moving on to the next slide, Bill was particularly keen for me to identify the couplings and the interactions that are present in the Earth system model, and in particular to identify some that are unique to UK ESM. So first of all, in terms of terrestrial emissions, we have isoprene and monoterpene emissions being determined by the land surface. So the isoprene is feeding into the chemistry mechanism, and the monoterpenes is acting as a precursor for SOA using a fixed yield approach. And there's also then primary dust emissions feeding into the Woodward bin scheme. In terms of marine emissions, The only gas phase marine emissions that are interactive in the model are DMS, feeding into the gas phase chemistry, which in turn is then producing sulfate aerosol. But we also have interactive sea salt and primary marine organic aerosol emissions. And this primary marine organic aerosols is something that was is coupled to the ocean biogeochemistry, so it's driven by the chlorophyll concentrations, but it's unique to the Earth system model over the physical model. And of course, it increases the background aerosol loading in the pre-industrial atmosphere. We also have deposition of the iron via dust deposition from the aerosol scheme to the ocean, and the aerosols are coupled to the atmosphere through aerosol radiation and aerosol cloud interactions, and likewise we've radiative feedback from some of the radiatively active gases, ozone, methane, and nitrous oxide. Okay, so I think that was all I wanted to say there. And then finally, my last slide is just showing you, apologies for the busyness of this slide, but this is giving you an overview of the simulations that we've carried out. So we've carried out all of the AerChemMIP simulations from Bill Collins's protocol and description paper from 2017, with the exception of PI CLIM ammonia, because UK ESM1 doesn't include an ammonium nitrate scheme, but we've carried out all the others. We've also carried out some complementary tier 1 simulations from the radiative forcing MIP, in particular some additional PI CLIM experiments, and these just complement the set of the AerChemMIP experiments to give us the full suite of anthropogenic forcings. Then after the Collins et al. Paper was published, there was proposed new experiments for AerChemMIP, in particular combining the low near-term climate forcer pathway, which wasn't including methane, but building a methane pathway on top. And Stephen mentioned these in a study by Rob Allen. And also a late proposed experiment for AerChemMIP was again a future pathway following SSP 370, but actually fixing the climate at present day levels. So again, with UK ESM1, we have carried out those three. And we've done some non-official experiments, which again we felt would be useful in terms of interpretation. In particular, we've done another future pathway, but this time allowing the climate to change, but fixing the emissions at present day levels. So we've given it a name of SSP 370. PD emissions, and it is an atmosphere only, not a coupled one. AerChemMIP also tended to treat the non-methane ozone precursors together, but actually in some of the attribution studies that we wanted to do, we wanted to separate those out a little bit. So we have done 2 historical simulations, one where NOx emissions are fixed at pre-industrial levels, and the other where both VOC and CO emissions are fixed at pre-industrial levels. So all of those data are available and are and are ready for analysis. So they're either available on the ESGF or through the Met Office tape archive, and we're happy to assist anyone who wants access to them. Thank you.
Okay. I have a question, I think, from Bill, which says, can we learn anything about the Earth system by comparing the same simulations from HADGEM3 and UK ESM1? I think that's a question to you, Fiona.
I think that's an interesting question, and I think Jane will pick up on some of that in her lightning talk, particularly because, as you say, we have very clear traceability between HADGEM3 and UK ESM1, so we can at least determine the role of these different interactions on model responses. So I think Jane will touch on that in her lightning talk later. And she has confirmed that in the chat.
And Bill also asks if the PI NOx and PI VOC simulations will be semerized.
We can semorize them. It would make it easier for us if you were to upgrade the controlled vocabulary to make them an allowable official experiment. And actually, I think it would be useful if other models did those experiments as well. So yeah, we can certainly consider that.
Okay, I think those are all the questions. It's time to move on to the lightning talks, I think. If I could invite James Keeble to unmute himself, and if you indicate to me when you want the next slide, I'll be happy to press the space bar.
Sure thing, thanks Paul. Yeah, so next slide please. Yeah, so I'm James Keeble, I'm a NCAS postdoc at Cambridge, and I've got many interests in the kind of CMIP6 data set that's been built up over the last few years, but my primary interest is in looking at stratospheric ozone in these CMIP6 models. And I have led a paper which many people have contributed to, assessing how stratospheric ozone has evolved from 1850 to the present day in these models, and then how it may evolve in the future under the various SSP scenarios. And that paper's about to leave kind of discussion, hopefully be accepted. But we can see when we kind of look at the CMIP6 multi-model mean, we have kind of very nice kind of changes in total column ozone that we understand, kind of partly driven by, in the future, reductions in CFCs and then increases in CO2. Next slide, please. But that those multi-model means are hiding a huge range between the individual models themselves. And so we see on this figure on the top left, the kind of historical total column ozone from 1850 to the present day, almost global average total column ozone, and they're spanning a range of 80, 60 odd Dobson units, which is incredibly broad. And even if we were to normalize all those models to their 1980s values, we still see a large range in behavior. So kind of coming out of this analysis is really kind of three kind of primary interested kind of research questions. The first is like, why is total column ozone in UK ESM1 so high? In the top left figure, UK ESM1 is that pink line. And a group of us have been working on that, and now we think we have a good handle on why that is and how to improve that. The second key research question we might ask ourselves is, can we use these CMIP6 models to say something concrete about what ozone looked like in the pre-industrial? It's obviously very challenging given the range between the models, but if we come up with some idea on how we kind of weight models and how we kind of rank models, maybe we could come up with a kind of climatological ozone field for the pre-industrial that could be used by models without interactive chemistry. And then the final research question is, given the range in kind of trends in total column ozone and the absolute values in total column ozone between these models, is this having a significant climate effect that kind of can explain some of the climate differences we see between CMIP6 models? And certainly this work has already begun. I know that Olaf, for example, has led a really interesting paper in this area, but there's still a wealth of kind of research to do here to understand really how this kind of bottom left figure that we see here is kind of driving regional circulation and climate differences. And that's it for my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, James. In the interest of time, we'll have questions in the chat or in the Google Doc. So please paste them in there if you've got questions or comments for James and for any of the other speakers. So I'd like to invite David Stevenson to unmute and present his slides. Let me know when you want the next slide.
Hi, Paul. Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, can I have the next slide? Thanks. Okay, so these are results from the paper published in to do with the first phase of AerChemMIP. So these are modelled global OH trends from 1850 up to present day. And I appreciate this workshop was supposed to be about future analysis. So I guess that isn't just about the future scenarios, but what more we can do. So one thing to say is we've only looked at 3 models, GFDL, CSM, and UK ESM. So those 3 models on this historical plot look relatively similar, broadly consistent. So they show relatively flat OH trends up to about 1980, and then this quite sharp increase in the last 30, 40 years. And we have compared this with observation-based inversions of OH over this period, 1980 to present. And I would argue that the models are just about consistent with these observations, and given the uncertainty range, which is this the orange bars on this plot. But most of those inversions suggest a somewhat of an increase up to 2005 and then a decrease. So there is quite different behavior. So there's certainly a divergence in behavior after 2005. So whether these model trends are realistic or not is relatively unknown, I would say, at this stage. Next slide, please. So the top plot is just a repeat of that plot, but we've looked into the drivers of these OH trends. And I'm just splitting this into the two time periods, so the 1850 up to 1980, where the trend is flat. And essentially what is going on there is a balance between the drivers. So the methane increases have driven down OH, but the increases in near-term climate forces, in particular NOx, have pushed. Sorry, have pushed up OH. And the interesting thing really is since 1980, the increase in OH really reflects a mismatch in the balance of those drivers. So although methane has continued to increase and depress OH, it has been outweighed by the growth of NOx and to some extent the decline in carbon monoxide over that time period as well. We've managed to diagnose a residual component which we hoped would reflect climate change impacts over the time period. So that's this pale blue teal color on the plot. Now, it isn't purely a climate change component, but it also reflects nonlinear interactions between the drivers. Basically, the change in methane will differ depending on how much NOx there is in the atmosphere. So really what this is saying is that the future mix of emissions, climate change, and how they interact with each other will all quite strongly influence how OH evolves in the future. And I think we certainly shouldn't assume that OH is going to be flat in the future. I think all those future scenarios with very different behaviors for NOx and methane and other gases will have quite strong influences on OH. So I was interested to note that the future scenarios have prescribed methane. So we're going to have to be quite careful with how we diagnose really what that means in terms of future methane emissions and how they translate into future methane concentrations, because those are in the scenarios that's been assumed what the behavior is going to be like. So I think we need to be quite careful about unpicking these different influences on methane through OH. And of course, there'll be influences of these changes in OH on oxidants, on aerosols as well, that will be rather interesting. I'll stop.
Thank you. Let's go on to the next one. Can't be Stephen again, can it?
It can.
Yeah, looks like it is, I'm afraid.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Yeah. No, I'm delighted. Just thought my computer had gone wrong in a whole new way. Right, Stephen, over to you.
Yeah, okay, yeah, sorry. Yeah, I won't say much more. You probably heard enough from me today, but I thought I'd just put a couple in on what I was now doing into the now and into the future. So next slide, please, Paul. Yes, okay, so I've started now looking at some of these future sensitivity scenarios. So as I was sort of listing in my earlier talk about what's driving the different changes in the future response, this is almost an idea now of, there's been lots of sensitivity studies done in AerChemMIP off this SSP 370 scenario. So this is SSP 370 with fixed SSTs at the top. And then, especially for UK ASM1, so this is the UK ASM1 surface ozone change in all of these different scenarios down the left. So not all models have done these, and one of my future tasks is possibly to look at different models and how their response differs, but we can try and separate in the future. The first row down, the first scenario is a fixed climate one, so we can see the climate change signal on Earth surface ozone. We've done a fixed emissions in UK ASM1, so we can see the emission impact. There's a land use change scenario there, so there's also a land use change and how that impacts on surface ozone. And there's only low aerosol emissions, low ozone precursor emissions, low methane concentrations, and then some different combinations of others at the bottom. So this allows us in this model anyway, in the UK ASM model, to see the different influences of the different changes on the future emission pathway, future mitigation pathway of the different scenarios. So yeah, this is going to be looking, I've done this for aerosols as well as ozone, and then maybe look at some radiation to see how the different short-lived and near-term climate forces are impacted by these different mitigation pathways. So I think this could be quite useful to see what changes have what effect, and it's already throwing up something that reducing the aerosols in this scenario gives a significant change in surface ozone in this model, and that's probably due to some of the couplings interactions that are included or maybe aren't missing to make this change different. So, and then the land use change is also quite interesting as well. So that's future work to explore these changes. So next slide, please, Paul. So just to focus on one of these, there's been some interest now in looking at this SSP3 scenario with fixed SSTs, so to really diagnose the climate change impact on ozone and PM, or for my interest anyway, to look at that. And there's obviously everything else you can get from this. There's 4 models that have done this additional scenario now in terms of AerChemMIP. And I've been looking at the impact now this climate change signal has on these air pollutants to see if we can get some sort of signal on different regions. So this has mainly been driven with an IPCC influence as well, and they're quite interested to put something in about this. So what mainly the models are showing anyway, just this broad thing, and again, further work to look into the mechanisms behind this and what's actually going for the changes, that the impact of a future increase in temperatures has generally reduced ozone over most regions. So there's not a strong ozone penalty over the polluted continental regions in these global models. So that's quite an interesting result. And again, for what I've been seeing so far, they're looking at the surface PM 2.5 changes. There's tended to be climate change has tended to increase surface PM 2.5 over most of these models. Slightly, not massively, but again, just looking at these bar changes where you can see the green is the climate only signal. You can see over Southern Asia, there is this increase in surface PM 2.5, which is significant and consistent in all the models as well, and some of the others it's a bit noisy as well. So this is just to highlight we can look at these different sensitivity scenarios now in more detail to see what different drivers are having an impact on the surface level pollutants and other variables of choice as well in these scenarios. So I think you've probably heard enough from me, so I'll leave it there, and that's my 2 slides. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Stephen. Zhenze Liu, please.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep, oh, great.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Can you move into the next slide? Yeah. Morning, everyone. I'm Zhenze. I'm a PhD student in the University of Edinburgh, supervised by Bruce Doherty, Oliver Wilde, Fiona, and Steven Turnock. Today, I'm going to show you some new capabilities being developed in UKCA. When I use old version of UKCA, I find, because I focus on air pollution, regional ozone pollution in China, and I find these surface ozone concentrations are always underestimated. So we think why? We think why? There are many uncertainties in the model, but we think emissions are quite important. And for those high emission areas, those active VOC are necessary, but they are not actually included in the model. So based on that, we developed the chemistry scheme to allow more VOC species, especially those active VOC species in model. And we hope to see the ozone will be increased. And that's what we expected in the model simulations. Another modification is for the format of emissions. Originally, UKES1 or UKCA only needs sector non-emissions, but instead now we can provide sector emissions in the model, because based on that, we can also apply independent diurnal vertical profiles of emissions to these emission files, because we also want to see the diurnal patterns of ozone, which can be simulated in a global chemistry climate model. So the bottom picture shows you the differences in the surface ozone concentrations with the standard UKES1 in the red panel and the UKES1 in the left panel with improved chemistry. And you can see the distribution of ozone are quite similar in both versions, but it's clear that in East Asia, especially in particular in China, the ozone production was increased, and that's what we expected, right? So can you move to the next slide? Yeah. And here, this slide shows you the evaluation of the surface ozone in China. There are some examples here, but I only show you one example in Beijing. And you can see the diurnal variation can be captured relatively well in Beijing. And it also shows you the ozone response surface in Beijing with changing lots of VOC emissions. And it will show you the VOC limited region in terms of the ozone sensitivity regions of this region. So these new capabilities, I think it made it possible to investigate the regional ozone pollution in such a global chemistry model. So we're also doing some future climate scenarios based on the UKES1 with update chemistry. Yes, thanks very much.
Thank you, Zhenze. Next person is Flossie Brown. Unmute yourself, please, and it's over to you.
Oh, hi, I'm Flossie. I'm a new PhD student supervised by Nadine. So if you could go to the next slide, please, Paul. So I'm at the moment looking at surface ozone in Africa and South America, and in particular using the AerChemMIP data. I've been looking at the SSP3 and also the SSP3 with fixed to present day climate. And the difference between these two should tell us about how surface ozone changes due to climate change alone. So this plot on the right-hand side is showing a 5-year prediction average, a 5-year average for the 2090 using the UK AerChemMIP model. And you can see that over regions with vegetation, there is actually an increase in surface ozone, which is just driven by climate change alone. So Paul, if you go to the next slide. So what I'll be doing is looking in more detail about what is driving those changes. So in particular, looking at biogenic changes and vegetation changes. So there's already some indication that there's a climate-driven decrease in dry deposition over some regions, and also changes in isoprene emissions. And then as I go on with the work, I'll be looking at the other models that have done these two simulations, and perhaps also looking at the effect of land use on ozone. So yeah, that's it from me.
Thanks, Flossie. Our next speaker is Jane Mulcahy.
Hi, good morning all. Yes, so I'm Jane Mulcahy from the UK AerChem Core Group in the Met Office. Yeah, you can go to the next slide, Paul, thanks. So yeah, I'm interested in looking at the role of the Earth system feedbacks. In the first instance, looking solely at UK AerChem model, but then there is the potential to expand on that, you know, further down the line if there's interest. But really looking at what is the role of these feedbacks on both forcing and on the future projections and some of the scenarios that we've been talking about today already. So as has already been highlighted by Fiona, you know, UK AerChem is one of the most interactive ESMs out there at the moment, we believe, in terms of the number of coupled interactions that we have tried to include in the model. And this is because in terms of future projections, we really do want to capture those processes and capture those feedbacks in as much as possible. And that is particularly the case in terms of aerosols. So again, I've highlighted this same schematic that Fiona showed earlier, and just highlighting in red those couplings linked to the aerosols in the model. And of course, what we also have is the Bill asked about earlier. We have the physical model component HAGEM 3 GC 3.1, where they often don't have many or any of these interactive couplings here highlighted in the red. So, you know, they have prescribed oxidants for the chemistry, they have fixed vegetation, they don't have the interactive BVOCs, and they don't, obviously, they actually don't include the PMOA at all, so then they're not driving anything with chlorophyll, and they have a prescribed, you know, DMS field. So I'm really interested in trying to exploit these two models to answer exactly the question that Bill asked earlier in terms of can we learn more about the Earth system by exploring these two models in a bit more detail. We tapped in a little bit on that in the Mulcahy et al. 2020 paper that's just coming out, that's due to be published soon. But I think there's a lot more to do there. That was looking at present day climate in terms of evaluation, and I think now the next step will be to really look into the impact on the forcing and potentially the future projections. So if we go to the next slide, please. Yes, so on the left-hand side here, I did start, well, it's over a year ago now, but I haven't had a chance to get back to this in the more recent time, where we've started to look at what the role of the feedbacks are on the historical aerosol ERF. So the left-hand plots here are showing the evolution of, I've done kind of 20-year kind of time slices along the historical period. And in the top left plot, what I've done here is started to switch off. So these do require some dedicated simulations, but I've started to switch off some of these coupled interactions like DMS, chlorophyll, the IBVOCs feeding into the monoterpenes, and the chemistry and so on. And so what we find in the bottom left-hand plot here, what you can see here actually interestingly is if we compare the physical model labeled here as GA 7.1 and then the coupled, fully coupled UK ESM1, you can see that in terms of historical ERF, these red and black dots there, you know, they actually have a very similar aerosol ERF throughout the historical period, maybe deviating slightly in the more recent past. But I think what this kind of feedback analysis shows, and in particular when you kind of start looking at the role of oxidants here in the blue, you can see that they actually get to this similar value by different means. So what we find is that the kind of interactive emissions tend to strengthen the ERF in UK AerChem1. So by switching off these interactions here in the top left, we weaken the forcing, and then similarly by switching the physical model to have a kind of UKASM kind of oxidants, we get a systematic weakening of the forcing. So there are these offsetting aspects of this. But this is really only kind of the start of this work. I've yet to kind of incorporate dust and different things in here. And you can see here in the middle plot how the evolution of these interactive emissions varies over the historical. And then on the right-hand side, I've just pulled out some examples here from the SSP 585 scenario in terms of how emissions of things like DMS, the monoterpenes, and dust also kind of are varying in these different scenarios. And so how it'll be quite interesting to look at how having this coupled feedback of both having these interactions in the model impacts this. So if anyone's interested, and of course, looking at future capabilities as well, you know, you can start considering fire and lightning or volcanic SO2. I mean, so we don't have that capability yet, but that is in development. So it'd be quite interesting to see to investigate these in the context of having these two models. So I'd be interested if anyone's interested or has ideas, please do get in touch. Thanks, Paul. That's me done.
Thanks, Jane. James Weaver, please.
Good morning, everybody. I'm James, working with Alex, Paul, and Scott in Cambridge. Next slide, please, Paul. So my interest is BVOCs. So sort of the groundwork was laid very nicely by Jill Thornhill's paper, which I know a lot of you guys worked on. And the main impacts of the BVOC chemistry, of course, are the increased methane lifetime, increased ozone, and increased secondary organic aerosol. And the last of which was the most sort of important effect in terms of their effect on climate. But what was interesting was first a significant difference between the different models when they were using interactive or fixed oxidants, because obviously emissions of isoprene and monoterpenes and so on deplete oxidants, so we see and then sort of more recent analysis does suggest that strat-trop in particular in UKSM is simulating a high model bias, at least at the surface, for both of these BVOCs, with consequences to SOA and oxidant depletion. Next slide, please, Paul. So really the work that I've been doing over the last year or so with Scott Archie-Nichols, he incorporated the first update to first COI mechanism, which is reduced chemical mechanism based on the MCM, and has undergone lots of testing by people like Mike Jenkin and Andrew Rickard and people like that. And then I've added the update to isoprene, and working on a paper which I hope to sort of submit early next year. This, in terms of the documentation, this is showing significant improvement in surface model isoprene and monoterpene modeling, i.e. the models reduce the high bias that strat-trop exhibits, and this is due to enhanced oxidant recycling. So we see much greater concentrations of OH in the boundary layer with knock-on effects for SOA production and so on. And other studies, a really good paper by Carset in 2018 has shown that the oxidant location really does affect aerosol formation and then latterly its radiative impact. So I'm intending to sort of reevaluate perhaps the AerChemMIP experiments with these updated mechanisms and really probing the effect of oxidants on this chemistry. Down the line, I may end up incorporating HOMS, but that's something that will probably be beyond me, but will be a sort of team effort, maybe with the guys in GLOMAP as well. But we now have the functionality to do that with sort of add-on to the CRY 2.2 mechanism, which was published a couple of months ago. Yeah, and I hope to be working with not just me, but sort of Kat Scott as well, and Alex and Scott on this. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Speaking of Kat Scott, over to you, Kat.
Hiya. Yes, morning, everyone. Could you go on to my next slide, please? So mine seamlessly follows on from what James was just saying there about the work that was done in Jill Thornhill's paper looking at feedbacks. And so in that, I've cropped a little figure out of Jill's paper here in the top right hand corner, looking at how what these numbers correspond to are basically the strength of a radiative effect as a result of a degree of warming. And so what we're seeing here is that some of these natural climate forces are changing as a result of a temperature change, or in fact, in this situation, it was as a result of the increased CO2, and kind of linking that back to how much of an impact on climate we think those changes would have. So within each of these, there's so many different things going on that it's very, very difficult to pick out exactly what's driving the difference between the difference between the different models, but also within each effect, there's a lot of different processes contributing to what that number ends up being. So as James was describing, there's a lot more we can look at here. So in terms of the BVOCs, just taking them specifically, we can see that the models that were involved in that paper give a range of responses in terms of a positive or a negative feedback, and that's based on how the aerosol and gas phase impacts balance out against one another. And so I've just included a little plot here in the bottom right of what happens when we look at the change to cloud droplet number concentration in simulations where, in a pre-industrial situation, we've doubled the emission of VOCs. And so we can start to try and pull out exactly the kind of contribution we're getting from these different parts of this. So I think there's two really interesting things we can look at here in terms of how different models treat this, but also looking at the response not just to a doubling of VOCs. I think James is interested in looking at different scaling. So is this can we assume this is a linear thing that well, no, we can't, but how non-linear is it? So that's what I'll say about that one. If you could just go on to my next slide, please. So the other thing that we're interested in looking at, this is something that Nadine and I have been thinking about, trying to look at the impacts of land use change. And in parallel to AerChemMIP, there's a land use MIP. And within that, models have simulated the historical period and various other experiments, but they've looked specifically at the historical period with land cover fixed to a pre-industrial. So taking out the role of land use change. But most of the models submitted versions for the land use MIP that didn't include interactive chemistry. So there's now an additional AerChemMIP simulation that looks at the historical period without any land use change in. So that will allow us to have a look at this period of time that I've shown in the purple box at the end, where we're seeing really strong changes between the distribution of different biomes, basically, how much land we've got being represented by these different land classes over that time. So that means we'll be able to have a look and try and pull out the impact of land use change on changes to these changes to emissions, but also the composition and the role of short-lived climate forces over that time. So a couple of models have run this additional experiment so far, and I'll be encouraging other modeling groups to contribute that simulation as well. So if anyone else is interested in this or what I had on the previous slide, just let me know.
Thanks, Kat. We have a contribution from Alex pre-recorded, but if he's on the line, we could also take. Oh no, we can't. I'll stop that and say share screen. Hang on. Okay, let's try that.
I'd like to just take you through my 2-minute lightning presentation on some things which I'm interested in working on as part of AerChemMIP. So the first thing is about dimethyl sulfide, and very recent observations made in the last few years have identified that the majority of the OH-initiated oxidation of dimethyl sulfide is occurring through a pathway which makes this molecule circled in red, hydroperoxymethyl thioformate. And there are very many open questions about this. Is this new pathway important? Could it change the amount of SO2 and the SO2 to sulfate ratio in the marine boundary layer? And so I'd like to use AerChemMIP models to understand what DMS, SO2 and sulfate look like across these models. And eventually what I would like to do is look at the impacts of including this new type of chemistry. I've started to compile DMS observations, and on the right I show a plot of UK ESM DMS in red and observed DMS in black. And you can see at this location in Tahiti, the model simulates lower levels of DMS than are observed. I'm also perennially interested in the idea of the uncertainty in simulations of tropospheric ozone. The figure on the left comes from work that Paul Young produced as part of the TOR tropospheric ozone chemistry assessment. And the figure in the middle is work that I produced recently with thanks to Paul Griffiths, looking at CMIP6 models. And again, what we're following is the method of Hawkins and Sutton to decompose the projections, or to decompose the force response in projections into uncertainty or variability that comes from internal variability, scenario variability, and model variability. So I'd like to use AerChemMIP and scenario MIP models to understand what the force response of ozone can be attributed to. And then I should say that's largely a scenario MIP question. But then with AerChemMIP, what I'd like to do is understand if we have confidence in this type of analysis. So is the model spread that I've calculated here for the force response in CMIP6 models, is this really accurate? Do we really have this little confidence in our model's ability to simulate tropospheric ozone? And so can we use some of the single forcing experiments to try and better constrain this? Thanks.
Thanks, Paul.